What's up guys? In this video I'm going to break down my approach to a traditional rendering. For me that's markers and airbrush on marker paper, and I'll get into the materials that I use as the video goes along. Okay, so I've already got a basic blue sketch done. Next thing I'm going to do is start to go over everything with a blue Bic Pen and some of what are called French curves and ship's curves. The ship's curves are like a bigger French curve essentially. In this stage, I'm more or less just cleaning up the initial sketch because I don't want to leave too much to chance. Some freehanding is okay, but I want to make sure that everything looks as tight and clean, especially for as an example. Since I already know what color I'm going to render this truck, I've got markers picked out. So I'm going to be using some Chartpak warm grays to do the portions that would be considered gold, and then later I'll use some cool grays for the silver. So I'm trying to do a good job of putting markers in clean and solid. You don't want to go too fast and you don't want to go too slow, but you want the lines to look really clean together. Some streaking is okay because reflective surfaces naturally are going to have some of that look anyways. Otherwise it would look really satiny. But you don't want too many pickups and too many seams, otherwise it can start to look blocky and a little bit amateurish. So next I'm going to break out these cool grays just to start to work in the second color, which is going to be the lowers and then the top of the cab. And I thought the cool gray and the warm gray might be a really nice contrast. And here I'm just blocking in the interior shape. Most of that's going to get buried, but I still want to imply it. I don't want to leave it to chance. Just going over the inks here with a little bit more value. These are basic grays to kind of give a little bit of purple cast to some of the ink, which just adds a little bit more interest to the look. I'm kind of going back and forth and tightening things up, seeing what needs to be balanced. I started to work on the seam between the cab and the bed, and the ink bled a little bit, which got away from me just a teeny tiny bit because the markers were really wet, but I'm going to clean it up at a later stage anyways. Next I'm going to jump into the wheels, and since I already know that they're going to be kind of a satiny finish, I'm just going to go over the entire wheel with a single pass of gray, and while it's wet I'm going to go back into it a couple more times to kind of make a little bit more value and a little bit more shading and shape out of it. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to decide that the contrast needs to look a little bit better. Maybe the spokes should be a little bit darker. When I'm working for fun on an idea like this, I kind of have liberty to change my mind as I go. So I'm going to go, hey, I actually think it should be even darker, just the spokes and the centers here, just because that contrast might look really nice against a lighter gray rim and against the gold and gray paint. Next, I've mixed up some airbrush colors that I'm going to airbrush straight over the ink, and I mix the color up off screen, and then I'm just doing a little test. And it's always important to test the colors because sometimes what's sprayed doesn't necessarily look exactly like how it's mixed. So that's sort of what happens here. I did a little test and I thought I need to mix up a little bit more color. So I'm going to go right over the gold that I have because I want to bring the saturation level up. This is, to me, is one of the best ways to do that. I rarely mask when I am doing these type of renderings because I consider this a little bit more of a quick rendering. It can be a little bit more loose, but I did airbrushing for a living for so many years that to me it makes a little bit more sense just to be a little bit more controlled in my approach with the airbrush so that I'm not putting overspray all over the place. Here I'm using Createx illustration paints, which will serve to be helpful in a later stage. So besides from the gold, I've also mixed up a black that's just kind of neutral, and then I've also mixed up a black that has a little bit of a blue tint to it. The blue tint one you'll see will go on the glass and some of the upper areas. So here I'm using an eraser to do what's called subtractive highlighting. So to do this, we're basically just erasing over some of the airbrush paint, some of the edges that I want to clean up or pull out some highlights. So the next thing I'm going to do is break out some ellipse tools. And the reason is, as we start to get through the process of this rendering, I really want to make sure that the details are accurate, and there's no sense in just winging it with some of these really important shapes like the wheels. To me, it's really important that the wheels are round. It's one of those details that can be make or break. There's a little bit of room to bend in perspective if you've drawn something really extra interesting, but generally they should read really accurately. This is part of why I don't concern myself with what's going to fall into those areas as I'm just creating shape and tone anyways, because I know I'm going to go back over it with ink, so it doesn't matter, as long as I'm careful and I don't lose the drawing in the process. So here I'm kind of tightening up the windows and the gaskets that go around everything, because these are the type of details that are going to help make something look a little bit more believable. And next I'm going to go in and start to tighten up some of the details on the wheels. I'm actually going to go over the ink and airbrush that's already there with an alcohol marker so that I can be a little bit more deliberate with the shapes and values. Even though they're going to be satin, I still need to represent the shapes correctly with value. So the spokes are going to be really, really dark, which means a lot of the work is going to be done in highlighting. So next I'm breaking out some colored pencils to start to define some of the edges and clean up some of the shape. For this, I prefer to use Poloychromo pencils and sometimes Prismacolors depending on what areas I'm working in. Of course, use a pencil sharpener, but also, as you can see on the screen there, I have a piece of sandpaper that I use to kind of file the tip into shape and keep it clean for every single line. And in this way, I'm not just running out of pencil all the time by sharpening it to death. So where there's dark edges, there are also going to be highlights and highlighted edges. So I'm kind of balancing between using the white pencil to highlight some edges and the dark pencil to create some of the edges. And at the same time, I'm cleaning up some of the marker artwork as well, where it went just barely into some of the areas a little bit too far. And here I'm starting to create some of the highlight areas where I know I'm actually going to put more paint, but I want to start to map everything. Each stage in each process kind of paves the way for the next stage and the next process. So even though everything is getting layered, one step will really help plan out the next step. So now I'm going back in and tightening the wheels up a little bit more. You notice the tools that I'm using are getting smaller and smaller as I'm working because I need to define even smaller areas and smaller details. I wouldn't over detail something with a huge paintbrush or a huge marker. So at this stage, the tools are getting smaller so that the details can get more accurate and smaller at the same time. So as I mentioned, the way that I'm doing the wheels is going to end up being a whole lot more highlighting. You could start with the white paper and kind of build everything down from there really slowly. But to me, these types of shapes take shape more naturally when it's a highlighted color over top of an existing color. And each person's method on these things is going to be a little bit different. This just happens to be my approach. So at the same time that I'm darkening, I'm also highlighting. And if I'm going back and forth and doing them, it's really easy to map out and make sure I don't lose my place somewhere. So I'm doing the wheels at the same time. I'm just keeping one pencil in each hand and going back and forth until I get the balance that I'm after. Just as the illustration's coming together, I'm starting to read the balance and see what needs a little bit more work and what needs what. So next I'm going to break out some paints and start to do all the highlights and details. This is really the time where things really start to jump off the page. And because I'm rendering glossy surfaces, I have a lot more freedom to make harsh lines and bright highlights that might not be totally realistic for the sake of illustration, and contrast works really good. So you can see I'm starting to go over a lot of the lines that I'd already put down. So I'd mapped out what I was going to do in pencil, and now I'm going over a lot of it with what's AcrylaGouache. So the AcrylaGouache will give me the space to put down white, and then I can use a wet paintbrush and blend out the edge. So I'm highlighting some of the areas and some of the upper lines, edges, and parts of the surface because I want to imply that these edges are pointing upwards, and the light edges, just like the dark edges, help define the shape. So I'm just kind of going back and forth and putting some details in and just always checking the balance to make sure everything is starting to look the way that I want. So here I'm starting to paint in some of the details on the wheels. Even though I'd already spent a ton of time doing this with marker and pencil, now I'm going to go over everything with a little bit of this gouache and blend it out with another paintbrush. And the reason for this, again, is just contrast. Even though the surface is satiny, I still want it to have a lot of pop in the illustration. So if it's too dull, then it doesn't really have this great impact that I'm looking for. I don't want to overdo it because I don't want it to be too shiny, but I don't want to underdo it and have no detail showing whatsoever. And at this stage, now that I'm looking at the colors together, I have this idea for a pinstripe down the side and around the wheel wells, but not to split up the two-tone, but to highlight the body line that protrudes the furthest out. And my thinking was, I'll just take some vermilion and I'll run this stripe freehand around everything. And since I used to do pinstriping for a living, running these lines freehand, to me, is pretty natural. It doesn't take any more or less time to do them this way, but it could have been done with pencil, or you could have masked them out. But for me, this is the fastest way to get to the end result. And already I think the design is improved just by adding that pinstripe line. It kind of balances the look of everything and kind of brings the attention down to where the color is split without being so on the nose at the split. So now that I've got that in place, I can really start to work on the bigger, fatter highlights. And then next, I'll break out a paintbrush and some same acrylic gouache to hit the bigger, fatter highlights. And in this way I can mix the paint a little bit heavier, a little bit less reduced with water, so I can make these really bright, harsh highlights and hotspots. You can bend some rules here, but you still want to fall in the realm of the formula of the way light works. Just a few last little highlights, and that really tidies everything up. I have a tendency to over-detail towards the end, but it's all part of the balancing act. I feel like this area is a little bit sharper, now this area needs to be a little bit duller, but I want to be careful to not overdo it, which can be really easy. Well, thank you guys so much for watching this video. I hope it was helpful. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.